you've spent so much of your lifetime in broadcast, and now you're not in broadcast anymore, but what possessed you to sit down and put this down on paper and turn it into a book where you told a story?
They did. In a way, the publisher called me and said, journalism professors love to assign outside reading by reporters who are experienced. Can you write me a book kind of outlining what television was like in the early days, the formative days of the first days, really, of television news? When I was there at the time, I didn't realize that that's what was going on. But it was, and so they, in a sense, were the target. I just thought it was a terrific idea. So the book was written with journalism students in mind, which is maybe why there's a little more detail about production than the average reader would want, especially in the first chapter.
Yeah, there's a lot of talking about production in this book, and for anyone who's not familiar with how a television studio works, you get an eye-opening experience about what's involved in producing TV, and especially from back before they had the sort of technology that there is today. You've seen a world full of experiences in a newsroom and how the technology shifted. It
was probably the most amazing thing of all of the 34 years in the business was the changing technology, because I started shooting black and white negative film because electronically it's easier to reverse it than it is to develop positive pictures. But let me tell you, trying to edit negative film, I mean, everybody looks at negatives, and when it was color, it was really insane. But on a little screen like this, sometimes I had no clue what the cameraman was exactly editing. But then came color film, and then came tape, and then came live, and the business so changed. I mention in the book that sometimes reporters had to leave because they couldn't adjust to some of the changing technology, and I think the biggest one was the emphasis on live. When I first started, every reporter would write out the stand-up and then memorize it, and it became, within about 10 years, there was just no time to do that. You had to be able to go on live and be coherent and articulate, and there were some people who simply could not do that.
Well, that was one of the biggest strengths you had in our market. I mean, I was a religious Ed Dague watcher my entire life, and I spent 18 years in newsrooms, so that was I only watched Ed Dague because I depended on you to give me what I needed to know from my television news. And I know other newsrooms did the same thing. But how do you go from being in front of that camera to sitting down with all those experiences and making a book out of it?
I don't know, and I was really anxious about that because I never took a college writing course in my life. You know, I studied engineering, although I can't do any calculus anymore either. I didn't think I could, and I told my editor repeatedly, Dan Lynch, I need an awful lot of help with this. The first chapter I wrote was on my experiences with Erastus Corning, and he only offered one thing. I sent him the chapter, and he really liked it, but he said, you've identified a Channel 10 reporter as a gadfly reporter, and it clearly was Herb Starr. Why don't you name him? And that was my first encounter with the question then of who gets named and who doesn't. I didn't name Herb because it's not a very favorable reference, in fact, and I was reluctant to do that, but Dan helped me with that, and I know you worked with Dan Lynch as well.
I did.
So I started naming names.
Just the facts, right? That's the part of reporting. Get out the facts.
Exactly. And I didn't want to hurt anyone. When the book came out, I was interviewed by Paul Grondel of the Times Union, who in a sense was disappointed that there wasn't more dirt in it, I felt. He said to me, and it was not, I guess, in the paper or entirely on the record, but he said, gee, you must have known of affairs and people meeting women or men at the back doors, and none of that's in the book. And I said, of course. It's a factual book about journalism. It's not dirt about area TV people, and that's not in there.
That's an interesting question that Paul would have raised to you, because in early journalism, we did not report on the dirt about, for instance, our politicians.
Right.
If you think back to the days of Roosevelt or Kennedy, for instance. But you also saw that evolve. So when you were delivering the news from the early days until the most recent time when you were delivering the nightly news, how did you sense a change in the way?
Yes. And some of it was really unpleasant. I understood when Keith Olbermann quit the first time, and he quit because he got sick of reporting on the Monica Lewinsky. When my good friend and colleague Chris Kapostacci, now Chris Jensen, went to MSNBC, she encountered that as well. It was really at the time of the whole Clinton impeachment, and she told me at the time that there was kind of a comment going around MSNBC that it stood for mostly sex, nobody but Clinton.
Oh, no.
That bothered a lot of reporters. I was really bothered the night I reported on air, and I guess it had to be, because it was relevant, a comment by Monica Lewinsky that time to get my presidential knee pads, indicating that she had some intent when she went there. And it was probably important comment, but I was really uncomfortable reporting that sort of thing. But what are you going to do? You know, and much of my last chapter talks about the difficulty of having to give people what they want, because in this capitalist society, journalism has to make money, and that means you have to attract an audience. I also mentioned in the book, though, that I used to tell the staff, if we put together the best television newscast in the history of television and no one watches, we have achieved nothing. So there's this constant battle. You have to attract an audience, but to what extent do you go to attract them?
And I know you always, that was a fine line, because, and you talked about it in front of my class as well, that you wanted to make sure people still received some of the information they needed, and you made sure to deliver that.
Right.
How did you deliver that?
With the help of the fellow who's now news director at Channel 13 and who I helped hire as a producer at the time, Eric Hoppel is his name. Eric and I knew what the research said. Consistently, people have no interest in international news, especially, but they have to have some exposure. So we would kind of bury it in the second block. We'd pull them in the door and maybe tease something into the second block that was maybe even had some prurient interest, I don't know. But somewhere in that block we'd slip in some international and national news, knowing they probably weren't looking to hear it, but feeling that they should. And Eric was terrific with that, still is. The consultants may not have liked it, and that's a whole other thing I saw come into the business. When I started, Mega didn't exist, but it was pretty soon thereafter that marketing people started to realize, wow, we can do surveys, we can hold up pictures, we can do focus groups. And I mentioned in the book, there was a time in the business, in particularly the mid to late 90s, where male anchors simply started to disappear, and part of it was anchors who maybe had a receding hairline or something got tired of, in effect, submitting their entire career to a focus group's reaction to things like that. And it became too important. Very famous line by a news director, I think he was in Texas, about hiring attractive women to be reporters. He said, I can teach journalism, but I can't teach pretty.
Well, that's a question that comes even in the journalism department and the communications department at St. Rose. One of my colleagues says she was taught early, you have a great face for radio.
So, right. That's, yes.
And she tells the students that. But even our students, too, still think about, do I want to be on air? And initially they come in and they think they want to be an on-air personality, like an Ed Dague. But you talk about in the book how it's not everything it's cracked up to be.
No.
I mean, you talk about going out in Albany, and we know our small Albany market here. The market is each person knows the other, and it seems, especially if Ed Dague's delivering the nightly news, we know Ed Dague in the grocery store. So here people are going to see you and they're going to remember Ed was on TV and I used to always watch the news. How did you navigate the constant attention by people who live near you, who knew you?
Well, friends are one thing, although everyone has the same sort of thing. And there's a very famous story about that when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, one of his best friends was the managing editor of the Washington Post. And he was a friend of Jacqueline Kennedy as well. And I'm failing to come up with his name, but he was the principal in Watergate. But he was very disturbed after the Kennedy assassination when they were discussing funeral arrangements, and Jackie stopped and said to him, "This, of course, is not for publication." And that wounded him. Because everyone is constantly aware that anything they may say to you possibly could wind up on TV or in the newspaper, and that's a difficulty. It's a wall between everyone all the time, and in that case, he was stunned that it was a wall between he and one of his closest friends in the world at a time of great tragedy, and still that wall was recognized. This is not for the paper. I had that too. A lot of friends all the time. I'm going to tell you something, but it's off the record. On the other hand, there was a woman you may have once worked for who was editor of the Troy Record, who on a symposium I was involved in one day, noted that her kids understood they could not tell her anything that had happened in school or in their life because it might wind up in the newspaper. That's extreme. How you draw that line, I don't know. But there's some people like Erastus Corning. Well, let me go back further, though. I also note in the book that with politicians especially, there's an understanding of off the record, on the record. But in television, somehow, they seem to assume if it's not on camera, it's off the record, and that's absolutely not true. So I tell a story in the book of an area congressman who told me something very relevant. It was John Sweeney, when in his second term, when he was reelected and the Republicans scored big and there was now a much larger majority, they no longer needed the moderates from the Northeast to carry their basic votes in Congress. So John felt his position had diminished some. That's something that area viewers certainly should know. His constituents should know that. But when I asked him about it on air, right after he had told me about it, not off the record, but not on camera in studio, he dismissed it as, oh, something people always say. It's never true, never has been, never will be. And it was a lie. But you find you can't say, but wait a minute, you just told me, because you'd be saying that so often that it would actually start to affect your credibility, I felt. So you can't call them on it.
And that distinction that you're talking about, where some people, especially politicians who are so savvy with the media, they don't recognize, okay, this is a newspaper reporter, this is a television reporter, and what's the difference, and what's the difference between on and off the record. But to confide in a reporter that way and not understand the journalism is an interesting conundrum. And
not only that, sitting in the studio where he's about to give an interview, to confide that sort of thing. Now, part of the problem was, and here we go again with friendships, I had known John Sweeney for a very long time, since he was a really young politician in Troy, and I think he felt a friendship there that would prevent me from doing that sort of thing. But no, you're a member of Congress, your sway in Congress has just diminished, you've just told me about it, that's really news. There's just no way around it.
Did you always feel that loyalty to the viewers and the citizens that you're talking about when I need to tell this truth?
I got into journalism, and to television journalism in particular, because I thought it was the most powerful part of journalism, and I wanted to make a difference. So I got in for really ideological reasons. And yes, I always felt that way. I also felt, even though I was very political all the time growing up, very, very staunchly anti-Vietnam War, I knew it was a mistake, but I couldn't let that show because of my own idealism. I understood the concept of objectivity, that people expected it and that it had to be. So I worked very hard to, one, understand what I think, and two, keep it out. And you first have to understand what you think in order to be able to keep it out of your writing or your ad-libbing.
Right, and the critical reflection you are talking about, I think in watching news now and in reading the news, I feel sometimes it's not the way it was, or there's a reason there's less credibility, and the public has more suspect or is more suspicious of broadcasters and reporters on the newspaper. But you managed to keep that credibility the whole time.